When James Carter returned home after a long trip, he found something unbelievable on his own land, a cemetery that the HOA had built without his permission. And his biggest enemy, the smug HOA president, Richard Gleason, didn't just refuse to apologize. He claimed James's land was underutilized and that the graves were now sacred. But Richard had no idea that this land held a dark secret, one that could turn his entire scheme into a federal crime. And when the EPA, reporters, and lawyers came crashing down on the HOA, James just kicked back on his porch, cracked open a beer, and watched their world go up in flames. James Carter had spent over 3 decades on this land, and to him, it was more than just property. It was his legacy, his birthright, his home. His father had poured every cent he had into buying it, breaking his back to ensure it stayed in the family. His grandfather had built the house from the ground up, with nothing but sweat, raw determination, and hands so calloused they could split wood without gloves. Every damn inch of that land had history in it. The soil had soaked up years of hard labor, laughter, heartache, and triumph. James knew it like the back of his hand, the exact places where the grass grew a little wilder, the old oak tree his grandfather planted, the tiny pond where he learned to fish as a kid. He could walk the property blindfolded and never misstep. This wasn't just some plot of land. It was his world. So when he pulled into his driveway after a grueling month-long business trip and saw rows of tombstones standing neatly in the middle of his backyard, his mind simply refused to process it. For a second, he thought he was hallucinating. Maybe exhaustion was messing with his vision. Maybe the lack of sleep was playing tricks on him, because there was no way in hell there were actual graves on his property. Then he blinked. They didn't disappear. At first, he let out a short, humorless laugh, the kind that bubbles up when reality starts warping around you. A joke, right? Some elaborate Halloween prank? But the closer he got, the faster that laugh died in his throat. The tombstones were real, polished marble, etched names, fresh dirt, and the worst part, that smell. The sickly, unmistakable scent of turned soil, mixed with the faint, rotting musk of something that had been buried too recently. James's stomach twisted like he'd been sucker punched. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath turned shallow. This couldn't be happening. It was too surreal, too impossible. Who the hell builds a cemetery in someone's backyard without their permission? Rage burned through the confusion like a match to gasoline. He wasn't even thinking as he turned and stormed straight to the biggest house on the block, the one belonging to Richard Gleason. Richard, that smug, self-important, HOA-obsessed bastard. James knew him well. Everyone in the neighborhood did. The self-appointed king of the HOA, the type of man who got off on enforcing the most ridiculous rules possible. Fined people for having their trash cans out too long, sent nasty letters if a mailbox wasn't painted the exact shade of regulation brown. The kind of guy who thought rules applied to everyone but himself. James barely made it up the front steps before he started hammering on the door. Boom, 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 no answer. James pounded again, this time with enough force to make the doorframe tremble. Gleason, open the damn door, now! A few seconds later, the door swung open, and there he was, Richard Gleason, in all his insufferable glory. A glass of whiskey in hand, shirt crisp, silver hair neatly combed, standing there like he was completely unbothered by the fact that he had just violated the single most sacred principle of property ownership. James could feel his teeth grinding as he forced the words through clenched teeth. You got 10 seconds to explain why the hell there's a cemetery on my land before I start digging another grave. Your size. Richard's expression didn't change. In fact, the bastard had the audacity to smirk. James, you were gone for a while, he said casually, swirling his whiskey like they were discussing the weather. The HOA needed a spot for a community cemetery. Your land was underutilized. James felt something inside him snap. Underutilized? His land? His hands clenched into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. His jaw locked so hard he thought his molars might crack. Richard, meanwhile, was completely unfazed. It's just a few plots, he continued, waving a dismissive hand. Besides, it's a sacred place now. You can't just dig people up. James felt heat crawl up his neck. his entire body vibrating with the barely contained urge to punch Richard's smug face into the next century. His vision blurred at the edges, a pure white-hot rage surging through his veins. "Oh, you want to bet?" James hired a lawyer faster than Richard could finish sipping his overpriced whiskey. He didn't even stop to breathe, just yanked out his phone the second he got back in his truck, hands shaking with fury as he scrolled through contacts. Within the hour, he was sitting across from Mark Holloway, one of the most cutthroat real estate attorneys in the state. The man had a reputation for tearing apart shady contracts, and right now, James needed a legal bulldog willing to rip the HOA apart piece by piece. Mark listened, brows furrowing deeper with every detail. "They built a cemetery on your land without your consent?" His voice was so incredulous, so disbelieving, that James felt the rage in his chest tighten like a vice. "Yes," James gritted out, "and I want it gone." Mark leaned back, exhaling sharply. "That's illegal as hell. We can take them to court. Eminent domain laws don't apply to private organizations like an HOA. And unless there was a legal transfer of property, there wasn't. Then it should be an open and shut case." That was all James needed to hear. They filed an emergency injunction the next morning. Court dates were set. Papers were served. James had never taken the HOA seriously before, just a bunch of bored suburbanites on a power trip. But now it was war, and he was ready to bury them. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. James sat at the plaintiff's table, fists clenched, adrenaline coursing through him. Across from him sat Richard Gleason, looking annoyingly comfortable, sipping a damn bottle of Perrier like this was just another boring HOA meeting. Then the judge walked in, and the proceedings began. Mark came out swinging. He laid out the property rights violations, the complete lack of consent, the trespassing, the fact that bodies had been buried on James's land without so much as a courtesy call. He was crushing it, throwing down legal precedent after legal precedent. James could see the gears turning in the judge's head. For a brief, glorious moment, he thought they were about to walk out of there with a victory. And then Richard's lawyer stood up. The guy was a walking skeleton in a $1,000 suit, some HOA legal shark who clearly thrived on screwing people over. And he had one card up his sleeve, a clause, a tiny, buried in the fine print, forgotten over decades clause from the original purchase agreement when James's father had bought the land. Some arcane zoning loophole that, under extremely specific conditions, allowed for community enhancements to be made if a majority of the HOA board approved it. And guess what? A cemetery was classified as a community enhancement. James felt his stomach drop. No. This couldn't be happening. Mark pushed back, argued that this was an egregious misuse of the clause, that it didn't apply to land privately owned and not under HOA jurisdiction. But the opposing lawyer was like a snake, slithering through every legal technicality, twisting the words just enough to make it stick. Then came the final blow. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples, clearly hating every second of this nonsense. And then he spoke. "You can't remove it," he said, voice dull, like he was already moving on to the next case. "It's legally designated as a burial ground now." Silence. For a moment, James didn't even breathe. The words just sat there, pressing against his skull like a vice. Legally designated, as in permanent, as in unchangeable, his land, stolen. Right under his nose, and there was nothing he could do about it. He didn't hear what else the judge said, didn't hear the courtroom noise, the shuffling of papers, the murmurs of the crowd. His ears were ringing, his breath was short, his vision blurred around the edges. Richard stood up, patting his lawyer on the back, shaking hands like they'd just won the Super Bowl. He didn't even look at James at first, just adjusted his cufflinks, smoothed down his tie, let the smugness roll off him in waves. Then, as he passed James's table, he stopped. "Well," Richard said, voice syrupy with fake sympathy, "that's unfortunate." James didn't move, couldn't move. And then Richard did it. He smirked, the same damn smirk from before. James saw red. The days that followed were a blur of rage, disbelief, and pure, soul-crushing frustration. The HOA acted like they had just won the damn lottery. They threw meetings with champagne, literally toasting to their victory, laughing about how the new community cemetery was such a wonderful addition. James could hear them from his porch, the way they spoke about his land like it was theirs. Richard even had the audacity to start talking about expanding the cemetery on his property. James was spiraling. They had taken everything, his land, his peace, his sanity, and all he got in return was a plot next to a bunch of dead strangers? Oh, hell no. James sat in his living room, surrounded by a hurricane of paperwork, county records, zoning laws, property deeds, anything he could get his hands on. His laptop screen burned his eyes as he scrolled through decades-old documents, his fingers moving like a machine, clicking, highlighting, saving. Sleep? Not an option. Food? An afterthought. He was hunting, because if he couldn't fight them legally, he'd fight them creatively. The HOA thought they had him cornered, thought that they'd played their little game and won, but what they didn't understand, what Richard Gleason had failed to account for, was that James wasn't the type to roll over and accept defeat. They stole his land. They humiliated him. They turned his home into their personal playground. And now he was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. Days blurred together as he dove deeper into the archives, combing through every legal precedent, every loophole, every tiny, forgotten law that might give him an edge. He went to the county clerk's office so many times the staff started recognizing him. He dug through historical zoning changes, handwritten ledgers from decades ago, even microfiche records from the local library. Anything that might hold the key to obliterating the HOA in one strike. And then, at 3:42 a.m., his tired, bloodshot eyes landed on a single sheet of paper. It was buried deep in the county's digital archives, scanned from an old, yellow document. The text slightly faded, but still legible. He almost missed it. But as he read, his heart stopped. Then it started pounding. Because this wasn't just a loophole. This was a damn nuclear bomb. Before his grandfather bought the land, before the house was built, before a single blade of grass had been planted, the property had belonged to an old mining company. One of those shady, turn-of-the-century operations that popped up, bled the land dry, and vanished before anyone could hold them accountable. And in the 1920s, that company had been caught dumping toxic waste into the very soil James now called home. But here was the real kicker. That contamination had never been officially cleared, meaning that under federal law, the land was still classified as hazardous, meaning that, by extension, burying bodies on it was illegal. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming thrill of impending destruction. They had played their hand, thought they had won, thought they were untouchable. But they had made one fatal mistake. They built a cemetery on land that should have been condemned. James didn't waste a second. He filed a formal complaint with the Environmental Protection Agency, attaching every document, every legal statute, every shred of evidence. Then he sat back, cracked open a beer, and waited. The HOA wanted war. They had no idea what was coming. When the EPA hit the neighborhood, it wasn't a quiet, bureaucratic investigation. It was a damn apocalypse. One morning, just as James was finishing his coffee, the first wave arrived. Black SUVs, government plates, and men in suits with clipboards. Within the hour, it escalated. A convoy of EPA trucks, flashing lights, hazmat teams piling out in full protective gear, moving with the kind of precision you only see in disaster response units. By noon, it looked like the whole neighborhood had been declared a biohazard zone. James watched from his porch, arms crossed, lips curling in satisfaction, as the HOA members, who had strutted around like gods of the cul-de-sac just days before, now stood frozen in horror, eyes wide as EPA agents, taped off the cemetery with bright yellow hazard signs. Then came the news crews, local reporters first, then the bigger outlets, and before long, CNN. James had to fight back a laugh as he saw Richard Gleason, HOA overlord and professional smug bastard, try to weasel his way out of the camera's view. Didn't work. A microphone was shoved in his face. Mr. Gleason, how do you respond to allegations that the HOA illegally built a cemetery on toxic land? Richard, sweating through his dress shirt, tried to lie, tried to say it was a misunderstanding, tried to say the environmental concerns were being exaggerated. Then one of the EPA agents cut him off mid-sentence and handed him a legal notice on live television. James nearly choked on his beer. Because here's the thing, this wasn't just an environmental violation. This was a full-blown federal crime. Every single body buried in that cemetery had to be exhumed. Every headstone had to be removed. The beloved community cemetery that the HOA had celebrated, torn apart. And Richard? Oh, Richard. The entire HOA board was now under federal investigation for fraud, illegal zoning practices, and environmental violations. But Richard? He was personally sued by half the damn neighborhood for property damage, negligence, and emotional distress. Lawsuit after lawsuit piled up like bodies in the ground he had so smugly claimed. And James? James just sat back on his porch, cracked open another beer, and watched the world burn. He watched as the bulldozers rolled in, their engines roaring like war machines, ripping apart the cemetery plot by plot. He watched as Richard stood helplessly on the sidewalk, his face as red as the sunset, barking at lawyers on his phone like a dying man grasping at straws. Then, just when James thought the day couldn't get any better, Richard came storming up his driveway, foaming at the mouth, shaking with rage. "You!" Richard spat, his voice nearly cracking. "You did this!" James took a slow sip of his beer, savoring the taste. Then he met Richard's wild, furious eyes and gave him a smile so wide it could be framed as a trophy. "Looks like you got some open plots now, Richard," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Then he leaned forward, eyes glinting. "Need me to dig you one?"